Age of Overlord is here, and you need to know which board breakers are the most important to beat the best meta decks. What's up, Potion? You got Matt here, and welcome back to the Competitive YuGiOh video. Today, we're talking about board breakers post Age of Overlord and how they interact with some of the best meta decks. We've got a brand new format that we're all trying to figure out, and this video should help with that. So if you're excited for the video, then make sure to smash the like button, because if this video hits 75 likes, and I'll bring you a guide on the best meta decks post Age of Overlord. Also, if you like deck profiles, combos, meta discussions, and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos just like this one, you're gonna love this channel. So make sure to subscribe and help us reach our end of year goal of 2,000 subscribers. Now, with all that being said, here is the ultimate guide for the best board breakers in the post Age of Overlord competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format. Let's jump into it. So I've got 6 categories to talk to you about today, 4 of which are going to be very straightforward and self-explanatory. They're going to be playable in most main decks, playable in some main decks, playable in most side decks, and in some side decks. The last 2 are going to be niche and just don't. Niche is going to be for a card that is really good against very few decks, or for a card that can only be used in very few decks, while just don't will be basically the same thing as niche, but either the cards are more playable against other decks, or there's better options against those decks than the cards in this category. We're going to go in alphabetical order, so it starts us off with Alpha, the Master of Beasts, a card that we all thought was going to be like the new version of Pankratops, which is really good because this card is a free summon to the board, obviously fantastic, and it's a non-targeting, non-destruction form of removal, which is amazing. The problem is it's not a quick effect and it can only go after face-up monsters, which has its limitations. Unless your deck specifically revolves around the tri-beast types, I wouldn't bother playing Alpha. It's not that it's a bad card per se, it's just that it's rarely such a good card. So for that reason, I put it in the niche tier. Next up is Book of Eclipse, which was one of the most popular cards in the previous format when Kashtira was running around. It's a card that either just forces a negate, or it means that all non-link monsters will go face down. It isn't a terrible card, especially against decks that have a lot of targeting immunity, but the problem with it is that it can be negated by a simple card like Ash Blossom, which is a huge issue. It's pretty good against decks like the Sprite variants if you can get rid of the Carrot negate. It's also not bad against Vanquished Soul or Rescue Ace or even branded Chimeras. They don't put up too many negates. It's pretty low impact against a deck like Unchained because they can just destroy their face down defense position monsters anyways and still get advantage. And most of the time they're ending on a board with the Unchained Soul of Rage and the DDD Wave High King Caesar, and only one of those is going to be affected by the Book of Eclipse. There aren't too many decks in the format that really care about Book of Eclipse, and on top of that, there's not one deck that's an absolute blowout against, so for that reason, it's a niche card. Next up is Book of Lunar Eclipse, which is just a strictly worse version of Book of Eclipse. The fact that you have to target the 2 cards and you have to discard a card really hurts it. At least it can't be Ash Blossom to be negated, but it's not a good card at all right now. You're pretty much going -2, and there are so many better options that do basically the same thing, so for that reason, it belongs in the just don't tier. Book of Moon is one of the best generic cards of all time. It still sees play today in some main decks, but does that mean it really should, or is it just hype from the previous format? It has a lot of application both offensively and defensively, but basically you're looking to trade 1 for 1 as a board breaker, which is not that impactful. The best that you can get out of Book of Moon as a board breaker is like booking something like a Baronne de Fleur, which has to then decide, am I going to be using my negate, my one and only negate, or am I going to be going face down and possibly getting destroyed that turn? It's a tough call to make, but if that's the best that you can do, there are so many better options. It's seeing main deck play in Fluandereeze, and while I know it's a good card, there are still so many great board breakers on this tier list that are just going to be either more popular or more effective. So, for that reason, and it kills me to say this, it's going to be in the niche tier. Change of Heart is still a good card when used in the right matchup. Against Unchained, it's a fantastic option to steal their DDD Wave High King Caesar. The problem with Change of Heart is that it targets, and that really hurts especially against the Unchained matchup. It means that you can never go after the Unchained Soul of Rage assuming that your opponent has Escape set face down. If they do, they just chain the Escape, destroy their Soul of Rage, and destroy your Change of Heart, and then in a new chain, they activate Yama in their graveyard, banish, and summon back the Soul of Rage, which means you're basically back to square one. As good as it can be against Unchained, the best that it can do against a lot of the rest of the meta is like force out a negate against Dragon Link or Manadium or even Sprite variants. It's also really bad against decks like Vanquished Soul or Branded Chimera, even Purely and more. And for that reason, unfortunately, I have to put it into the niche tier. As for Mind Control, basically everything that I said for Change of Heart applies to this card as well. On top of that, the cards you take can be tributed or declare an attack, so honestly, just don't play Mind Control. Cosmic Cyclone is one of the most flexible forms of back row removal that we have available in today's meta. Because it can be chained to other cards, it's really good against floodgates like Anti-Spell Fragrance or Gozen Match or even Rivalry of Warlords. It's also really good against the Unchained back row or Fluandereeze cards, even great against Tierlist spells and traps, and of course against Labyrinth and Rescue Ace. It also has some application going first against cards that need to stay on the field to activate and resolve their effect, like field spells or continuous spells and traps. It's even pretty good at stopping the Sinful Spoils engine since you can banish the set copy of the original Sinful Spoils before they get a chance to activate it. It's not a stop to a specific engine or deck, it's mostly an anti-floodgate card, but some decks really want to take advantage of Cosmic Cyclone, and for that reason, it sees play in some side decks. Next up, we're going to talk about board wipes, specifically in Dark Hole, Raigeki, Lightning Storm, and Harpie's Feather Duster. Dark Hole will see a lot of play if decks are going to start taking advantage of Ibli a lot more because it destroys the Ibli from your side of the field. Raigeki is always going to be a solid card, but it's not going to be as good as Lightning Storm will be this format because it doesn't have the same type of utility. The fact that Lightning Storm can get rid of monsters or back row is huge, and one of the best decks of the format right now in Rescue Ace uses a lot of back row, so it's a great card to have for that situation. And the same goes for Harpie's Feather Duster. Having a one card that has no cost to get rid of all back row your opponent has is huge. So right now I would say the best card of this bunch is going to be Lightning Storm, and the worst card is going to be Raigeki, but where would they fall on the tier list? Dark Hole is a niche card since there aren't many problematic cards that are being given to other players like Ibli right now, but definitely has potential to rise. Raigeki also belongs in niche, but lower than Dark Hole because it doesn't have any extra value that it brings. It's simply just going to be destroying your opponents at the field, and that's it, which can be good in the right format. Lightning Storm belongs in most side decks because there's just so much utility. You can go after monsters or back row, and that's amazing. Harpie's Feather Duster should be found in most side decks. There aren't too many amazing matchups for it, but every player needs to be ready for the back row decks in the format. Dark Ruler No More is an objectively good card. It's really good against decks that are focused on monster combos and against boards that have the specific goal of ending on IP plus another monster to go into SP Little Knight on your turn. There are a few decks that don't really care about Dark Ruler No More because they can just summon back cards after you use the effect of it. So these are decks like Fluwandereeze, Unchained, Labyrinth, A Vanquished Soul, Chimera, Purely, even Tierlist. They all don't really care about the card too much. But the card is great against decks like Sprite, Mannadium, and Dragonlink because they're very heavy monster combo boards. The game can also never technically end on the turn you make Dark Ruler No More because your opponent can't take damage. That makes it tough to tier. Because SP Little Knight is such a format-defining card, any end board that focuses on summoning it is really weak to Dark Ruler No More. So, for that reason, Dark Ruler No More belongs in the some side decks tier. Dinowrestler Pankratops is a great card. The fact that it almost always represents a 1-for-2 for removal is really strong. It helps deal with back row and with smaller monsters because this card has a massive 2600 attack stat. But it's not an amazing card, and while it still will see some play in this format, it won't be seeing as much play as it has in formats in the past. So for that reason, it belongs in the playable in some side decks tier. Every once in a while, enemy controller becomes a really playable card. The fact that you have 2 great effects is really valuable on this card as well, and of course the fact that it's a quick play means a lot. Having the effect to put something to defense position to either beat over or have an Xyz monster attack into it to then be able to get to Zeus is really valuable. But the tribute take effect of Econ is the most important thing, especially because there's a lot of targeting negation in this format. If you're going to be normal summoning a copy of Hydrant, or you get out your copy of Turbulence and your opponent tries to imperm you, and you chain Econ, not only are you stealing the threat, but you're also resolving the effect of the targeted card. You have to be actually playing a deck that can take advantage of it, but we've seen a few lists at YCS Indianapolis, including the winner, play this card in the main deck. So it makes a lot of sense for me to place this card in the some side decks tier. So Evenly Matched is an interesting card this format. It has a few different matchups where it's really good, a few where it's really bad, but a lot where it's just okay. It's good against a lot of the control decks of the format, decks like Rescue Ace or Labyrinth or even Tierlament. It's also good against Rescue Ace, assuming they don't end on a board with Baronne de Fleur or Borreload Savage Dragon. In my opinion, it's below average against Purely and Vanquished Soul, but it's fine against decks like Sprite and Mannadium and Dragonlink because they have a lot of negates on the field. So at the worst case, it just baits out a negate, and at the best case, it eats away their entire board. Evenly Matched is a fantastic card, and even though you're giving up your battle phase, it should see play in most side decks. Forbidden Chalice is a very interesting card. Any form of quick play targeted negation is really nice, especially because you can use it in something like the draw phase. It is, however, just worse infinite impermanence, which is seeing play in so many different decks and can be used on your turn 0 while Chalice can't. In my opinion, the biggest problem with this card is that there's so many better options at doing basically the same thing. So for that reason, I'm putting it in the just don't tier. Moving on to Forbidden Droplet. Thankfully, Arise Heart is banned, so this card can come back into the format. It has so much upside. The fact that you can negate basically an entire board and you have the chance to not be responded to at all is really strong. It's a card that's very underrated in the format. I think we'll see a good amount of play, but only in the decks that can actually use it. There are some situations where it's better than Dark Ruler No More because 1, it's a quick play, and 2, you can still win in time because you can actually do damage to your opponent after using this card. The problem is the cost is just so high and not a lot of decks can take advantage of that right now. I'd love to put it higher, but for right now, Forbidden Droplets belongs in the some side decks tier. Herald of the Abyss has one application: to get rid of monsters that are unaffected by their opponent's card effects. Cards like Expurley Noir, even cards like Boral and Dragon to an extent. I know it's not as immune as Expurley Noir is, but it's still an annoying card for a lot of different decks. Everyone needs to have an out for the Purely end board, and the fact that this card is a normal spell so you can get it off of Triple Tactics Thrust is really good. It's a card that sees a lot of play in side decks right now, but because of how difficult it is for some decks to beat these Towers-esque cards, and because of the prevalence of Triple Tactics Thrust, I'm actually going to have it playable in some main decks. Kaijus have 3 main advantages, the first of which is that they don't care how big your opponent's board is because they can always get rid of the singular biggest threat. They also require no investment to get into, and they're always going to be 1-for-1 removal. And lastly, they don't restrict your game plan in any way unless you're playing Fluwandereeze. They are unsearchable, so it can be difficult to access them, but I do believe that they have a lot of utility in many matchups, and for that reason, they belong in most side decks. Since we just finished talking about Kaijus, let's start talking about cards that are very similar to Kaijus, and the first of which will be Lava Golem. Lava Golem is great against so many different decks since most decks are ending on 2 monsters or more. Lava Golem can beat the Unchained board of Wave Hacking Caesar and Soul of Rage. It can beat the Rescua's board of IP Masquerena plus Sunlight Wolf or Barone or whatever the case might be, so it has a lot of utility. The problem is it takes away your normal summon, so not a lot of decks can actually use it. There are very few decks that actually trust to play Lava Golem in the format right now. Some decks that can actually use the card are going to be Tierlist, Rescue Ace, Unchained, but all those just depend on the hand that you're being dealt, which is not that consistent. Since there are very few decks that can actually take advantage of it, I should put it in niche, but with how good it is against so many different decks, I'm actually going to put it into the playable in some side decks tier. Moving on to Winged Dragon of Raw Sphere mode, not many decks actually end on 3 impactful monsters or just 3 monsters in general. It also eats away at your normal summon. Right now, I'll be honest, it's just not as good as a card as Kaijus are or Lava Golems, and for that reason, I would put it into the just don't play it category. Santa Claus is basically just a Kaiju that can go into defense position, and it really only sees play in one side deck, and that's going to be Purely. If you're not playing Purely, just play Kaijus instead. Santa Claus has a small amount of utility in one of the best decks, so for that reason, I'm going to be putting it into the niche tier. Kashtira Fenrir is awesome. It's one of the best cards going second in the game, but it also has a lot of application going first. While Kashtira as a deck is not really part of the meta since Arise Heart's banning, Kashtira Fenrir definitely is. The fact that Fenrir is a free special summon, it replaces itself, and has the chance to get rid of 2 of your opponent's cards, one by battle and one by banishing face down, is so strong. It saw play throughout all of YCS Indianapolis and can be great going first and going second, so for that reason, it's the first card that will join the playable in most main decks tier. Kurikara Divincarnate was a great card in Kashtira format, but it's fallen off a cliff right now. Not many decks are giving you the opportunity to use Kurikara as your first action. And if you really want to tribute a card, just focus on going with Kaijus or Lava Golem instead. It's really weird to say, but right now, I put Kurikara in the just don't tier. Marionette Mite. One single format this card was really good. Unchained is no longer the most popular deck, and in my opinion, it's not the best deck of the format anymore. It's Rescue Ace. So Marionette Mite does very little against basically every deck of the format except for Unchained. So while I do want to say we can put it in niche for that reason, it's really only good against one deck, and there are better options against that deck nowadays anyways, so why would you play it? If you expect to see a lot of Unchained, then sure, put it in your side deck, but for right now, just don't play it. Moving on to Super Polymerization. Not every deck utilizes the full 15 cards in their extra deck, so they can take advantage of some Super Poly targets. Decks like Tierlist, Rescue Ace, Vanquish Soul, Labyrinth, even Chimera Brand can all take advantage of Super Poly quite a bit. It's also good against quite a few different decks like Rescue Ace if they leave 2 fires on the field, Tierlist, Chimera Branded, Dragon Link, and more. It's completely dead against some decks, but it's an absolute blowout against a lot of others. It's great going first and going second, and really relies heavily on the deck that you're playing. So for that reason, Super Poly is playable in some main decks. Triple Tactics Talents is one of the best cards in the game. The fact that you have 3 really good effects, either draw 2 cards, heal your opponent's monster, or look at your opponent's hand and take a card out, is really strong. Right now, everyone's trying to play around Triple Tactics Talents because they're trying to activate their spells and traps first before their monster effects, and if they are going to use a monster effect, they try to do that in the standby phase or even the battle phase. Not every deck can play around talents, so it'll either steal an opponent's monster without targeting, or it'll bait out another piece of negation that you don't have to worry about going forward. It's pretty obviously one of the best board breakers in the format today, so for that reason, I'm placing it in the playable in most main decks tier. Triple Tactics Thrust is arguably the best individual card on this tier list, but it's not the best board breaker. You have to play the right deck to take advantage of it, because if you decide to go for Thrust and the best thing you can do is set Imperm face down, then you're really not getting the full type of value. Honestly, the main deck that's going to be playing this card in their main deck is going to be Unchained, since they can pop their set spells and traps to be able to get more advantage. While Thrust is an amazing card, it's not always going to be the best card to have in your main deck, so for that reason, Triple Tactic Thrust will be joining the some main decks tier. Twin Twister is just a worse version of Cosmic Cyclone. It's a 2 for 2, yeah, but it destroys the cards, which really hurts, especially in a format where Unchained is still one of the best decks. While the card can get rid of more backrow than Cosmic Cyclone, it's never going to get rid of more cards than Harpie's Feather Duster, so it doesn't really make much sense to play it right now. There are so many better cards than Twin Twister right now, so for now, just don't play it. Moving on to Ultimate Slayer. This card here is going to have an impact this format. The format itself will revolve around quite a few different decks, but also one specific card in SP Little Knight, and this card can get rid of it pretty easily. It can beat any type of extra deck monster, assuming that you're actually playing that type in your extra deck, but most decks are playing them right now, so it feels pretty good to have it in your side deck. There are still some decks though that actually actually can't afford to play this card because of their extra deck limitations, so just keep that in mind. And it's for that reason it won't see any more play, so for the time being, I'm putting it into the some side decks tier. And finally is XYZ Encore, the final card on our list. This card is really bad against so many different decks, but it is it is the best way to deal with the purely board. The fact that you can use this card in the draw phase so your opponent can't get all the draws in the standby phase with their purely card effects is really strong. While it is only good against one specific deck, I think for the time being, because it's so good against that deck and that deck is so strong in the format, I would really recommend playing it in most side decks. And that is it. My tier list for the best board breakers in the post Age of Overlord competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format is looking like this. If you guys think I made any mistakes, let me know down in the comments below and we'll discuss it. If you made it this far in the video, you must have enjoyed it, even just a little bit. So do me a favor and smash the like button. If this video hits 75 likes, I will bring you a tier list on the best meta decks post Age of Overlord. Speaking of meta decks, if you want a guide on how to beat one of the best decks in the meta right now in Rescue Ace, make sure to check out the video right over here. And finally, consider subscribing to the channel for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos just like this one, and of course help us reach our end of year goal of 2,000 subscribers. Thank you all for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.